So we commissioned a photogrammetry survey from AOC Archaeology last year, funded by the Hunter Archaeological and Historical Trust. And it's apart from the outputs of the photogrammetry survey, some of which are available online. So the link there in situ will give you access to quite a lot of the images. But apart from that, the photogrammetry survey itself kind of opened our eyes. I think we all have that experience. You can feel very familiar with something, that's something in your area that you visited and seen, and you haven't really looked at it. So in many ways, it's made me in particular look so much more closely at this building and this place that was on Ling under my nose, but which I hadn't really thought a great deal about. So this is also a process of discovery, not just through the photogrammetry survey, but thinking in much more detail about what the site is like and what might have been going on there. So again, probably most of you will know where Ling is. It's a small island off the Argyll coast. It's very strategically located in a historic sense, obviously on a main sea route connecting the Irish Sea, North Channel, with the northwest coast, and also is located, as you can see, kind of between Irish Sea, Sand of Jura, and the access to the Great Glen. So it's been particularly through the medieval period, perhaps early and later, in a very strategic location. But it's also despite not being out in the Atlantic, it is located close to quite difficult seas. So from a maritime perspective, you've got very strong tidal streams, and of course very difficult challenges like Corryvreckan, grey dogs, and some very fast-running sounds. Historically, of course, it's within Dalriada, later the kingdoms of Man and the Isles and the Kingdom of the Isles, and also within the Lordship of Argyll or Lordship of Lorne as post-Somerled, as the Kingdom of the Isles breaks apart, and of course then later in the Lordship of the Isles. It often, though, seems to be at boundaries between subgroups within those wider kingdoms. So this might be part of Kilchattan's story. So the church itself, as you can see from the top photograph, it's located by the best land, the arable land on the island, and one particular safe anchorage to the east, but also another bay immediately to the west. So it's at a narrowing point in the island. It has an early dedication, at least the dedication is to an early St. Catton. So whether it's dedicated at that point or later on, we don't know. The building itself is just a simple one long rectangular space. The walls are surviving on three sides to wall height, although as you can see from that lower photograph, there's been quite a lot of removal of some of the finer stones, and the east end has unfortunately gone. The masonry is very typical of churches of the late 12th century, early 13th century, Knapdale, Kintyre, mid-Argyll. So this coarse, this rubble laid in courses with pinnings, and it's all local stone. So it's stone that can be found on Ling itself. It's considered to be late 12th century from some similarities to late 12th century churches, or at least what are supposed to be late 12th century churches in Knapdale and Kintyre. It served, so it was the parish church for Kilchattan parish, which covered Ling, Shuanatorsa, and other smaller islands around it. And it was in use until the late 17th century. It was, of course, it looks isolated now, but it was at the center of a settlement, probably the main settlement on Ling, until that was demolished in the mid-19th century. It's swept away, so there's no sign of that at all. Although we do have records from the earlier period. It was the site of a mansion house of one of the daughters of the Earl of Argyll, wife of Chief MacLean of Duart. So it was possibly quite an important place in the late medieval period. As you can see there from the photograph, the graveyard continues in use, and it's a very important place for the community. So the graffiti itself, which have been much photographed and also drawn. So they were first drawn by the Royal Commission in their 1970s survey. And their comments on the graffiti were that they are pre-Reformation. They depict medieval West Highland galleys and the work of children. We'll come back to that. So there was obviously a focus from quite early on the boats that were depicted. But again, we'll see that there's quite a lot more than just boats carved on the walls. Marion Campbell of Kilberry in the 1980s, she drew them and had expressed quite a lot of interest in them and said that she would look at churches elsewhere. We don't see any reports that she found any. But she made this an association between the graffiti and King Alexander, the Scots King Alexander II's expedition in 1249, when he came up to bring the head of the MacDougals to heel, because his lands and his titles straddled both the Isles under the Norwegian king and mainland areas under the King of the Scots. But she did also point to similarities with Norwegian graffiti. There's some subsequent work, but again, a little bit of debate about whether these are the work of children, suggesting it's possibly galley crews, and that they must have marked a memorable event, possibly Scots or Norse. Dennis Rickson, in his book on the West Highland Galley, was particularly interested in the drawings of the boats as source of information on the type of boats being used during this later medieval period. And again, he suggested that there might be a connection with these two expeditions, 1249 Scots and 1260, the important one, 1263, led by King Haakon, which Alison wrote a very interesting account of, demonstrating how that expedition would have, the routes that it would have followed down through the Hebrides and back up again. And then MacDonald, in his important book on the Sea Kings, suggests the Kilchattan church graffiti is one of the five important sites in Argyll and the Isles. But he suggested they were West Highland galleys and possibly made by children. And that's really the sum of the interpretations of the graffiti to date. Again, so strong focus on the boats and a particular focus on these two expeditions. So just have a look at where the graffiti is located, and you'll see why there have been suggestions that they may have been made by children, because they're generally at quite a low height on the walls, very similar height. Although there's a question of survival, so whether there were other graffiti that can't now be identified. But it's noticeable that they are located at this very similar height. But it is the height, for example, of an adult kneeling, and this is a church, and we'll come back to that. They're all except one patch of graffiti on the outer walls. There's just one stone with graffiti in the interior. And again, this is a little bit unusual. Is this a question of survival? Were there graffiti inside? We can't identify any more at the moment. And this is a little bit untypical to find so much on the exterior of a church and so little on the inside. So I'm just going to run through the main stones with the graffiti and with just a quick description of what we're seeing there. So this is a stone which is in the west wall, and we are fairly sure that the incised cross on this, this is not later medieval, this is early medieval, and it's most probably an early grave marker, and it's obviously been turned 90 degrees, so it was quite possibly there in the burial ground when the church was built, and it was embedded in the wall. And so you see here it's a incised pendant cross, very typical of early medieval grave markers in this region. But that's the only one we have appears to be of early medieval date. So the first two stones I'm going to present are the ones that are the most well known and the most photographed, and are quite dramatic. This is a very dramatic stone with these multiple longboats or galleys. As you see here, these flat-bottomed, high prows, single stem, and then you see some of the mast stays or perhaps rigging. For the boats which appeared to be rather more long boats, there are no sails depicted on the boats themselves. So we see here quite a lot of boats. The most visible ones obviously here, and kind of sitting underneath it or behind it. So perhaps depicting a mini fleet. We see again the boat outline here, another smaller one here. And then once you get your eye in, you can see quite a lot more. So there's another one here. There's a partial one here, the stones flaked off. There are much more difficult, obviously, to see here. And you can probably see one over here on the left. So quite a busy stone with these boats. Also very clear crosses on this stone, with this one very elaborate cross that you can see here. And these other crosses, one here, one here. And once one starts to look more closely, quite a lot of incised lines. And although there are obviously lines on the natural lines on the stone, there are a lot of lightly incised lines, particularly on the left hand of the stone here. And I'm just now starting to look in a bit more detail and seeing other symbols. So here, down here, just to the left of this little boat, you can see here there's a kind of arrow type symbol. And there are also pecked dots. And again, although on first sight you might think that they are just natural, there are clear differences between dots which appear to have been pecked deliberately out of the stone, and more natural ones like this here. So to the left of the boat stone is this one. And this is a little bit more difficult to interpret. It's been said in the past that what we're seeing here is a boat. So here you see the boat outline with quite possibly a sail, or there may be some other explanations to this. So it could be a sail. The sails, of course, were made in wool. They were huge, square, heavy sails, which were sewn in pieces together. So it's not impossible that that's what we're seeing. But there are perhaps other ways of looking at this. One of the most significant features, in my view, on this is this carving here, which is very similar in appearance to weather vanes, and I'll come back to this later and show you some other images. Again, this also has crosses on it. So there's one here. And of course, it's not impossible that some of these markings are also crosses. There's another cross here. And can you see in the middle the way the stone's been pecked out? So many of you will know Zoe Fleming, who's luckily got lots of geological expertise. And we've looked at these together in terms of what might be natural and what has been carved or incised or pecked by hand. And we're fairly sure that this is deliberate. This is not a natural pecking here. And then this is this rather curious symbol, kind of triangular symbol, again with some peck dots. I'm wondering if it may be a merchant's mark. Of course, you'll probably all be familiar with mason's marks. Medieval churches also have quite a lot of marks of merchants in them. Although the English expert on medieval church graffiti is a little bit uncertain by my suggestion with that regard. So this is moving to, those were both on the south wall. This is on the north wall. It's just to the right of the entrance. So this is a stone, long, thin stone immediately to the right of the entrance. And there are several mini longboats on them. They're quite small and quite difficult to see unless there's light raked onto the stone. Again, it's the same. These are very stylized boats. This double line to indicate the boat outline, single mast, and then in some cases you can see the mast stays. Again, on the north-facing wall, but this is to the left of the entrance, so it's closer to the chancel end of the church. And we've got apparently three boats depicted here. So there's one here with double line indicating the mast, without a raised sail. Again, this may well be another boat. At least it looks like the mast with mast stays and or rigging. And then, of course, here we've got a boat with an animal's head. So you can see the ears poking up here and the snout. You can see how deeply incised the mast and the mast stays are, and the way that they run through the boat. So it's, again, with the other stones, it does look as if some lines are much more deeply incised, whether that's because people have come back and re-incised them, or whether this is an original creation, we're not sure at this point. One of the unusual features on this boat is this kind of superstructure, and I'm not sure if this is the sail may well have been used as a kind of awning when the boat's at rest, if you like, is berthed. So it's possible that, or some boats had fighting superstructures on them, and that's quite commonly depicted in medieval manuscripts. So again, we're just trying to have a look and identify what some of the features on these stones might be. South-facing wall. This is the second boat with an animal's head. It's much more faint, but the prow here, we can see the little ear and the way this curves at the snout. This isn't so clear, but we're fairly sure that this is another animal head. Again, in this case, you can see the sail. The sail is raised, the sail arm is raised, and it's partly unfurled. And we've got these triangular symbols as well, these triangular markings, this extremely deeply incised. And there's another rather fainter one here. And then you can see very clearly here these kind of incised lines and pecked dots. And there's quite a complex of those. So as if people have come and remarked and marked this stone. And this is just the final one I'm going to show. These two photographs are actually sort of two ends of this stone, so it's quite a long stone. On the left-hand end is this star marking with a possible line around here. The closest I can get to this is a merle, which would usually be a little bit squarer here. But again, these were very common symbols in the medieval period to ward off evil spirits. And here, although some of this horizontal line is natural, the vertical lines are made by human hand. And you can see here that these are possibly more boat outlines. So this longer one, these here, and up at the top. So that's just a quick run through. In the interior, this is the only one that's in the interior. Where it's located is so coming in through the door into the nave and turn right, and it's immediately there. And this would normally be where the holy water stoup or font would have been located. So so it's possible that this is on the wall immediately behind that. And again, you can see, although some of the horizontal lines may be natural, the vertical lines are certainly not. There are it looks a bit of a mess initially, and then when you get your eye in, you can see that these there are kind of almost a zigzag lines here, and this line here has a whole series of pecked dots at regular intervals all the way down it. And Zoe assures me that this is not natural. So just some observations. Obviously, the graffiti are on a church. We don't know if some graffiti has been lost. The church would have been rendered and lime washed. Certainly inside, perhaps, certainly lime washed outside, rendering we're not sure. So have we lost any? Is the location partly due to the type of stone? We don't think so, although mostly the type of stone that's being incised is a slaty type stone, so relatively easy to carve. But there's other stone which would be equally easy to incise, which do not have graffiti on them. They are predominantly the height of a kneeling adult, and that combined with the fact that they're on a church would suggest that they're devotional intent. They're at the nave end of the church. Of course, we have lost the eastern end, but there are no graffiti beyond what may have been the division between the chancel and the nave in the inside of the church. There's perhaps a difference in the distribution. So the notable longboats and crosses appear to be at the west end. Animal boat heads nearer the chancel end. And the internal graffiti, as I said, may be located near to where the font was. They're all stylized boats, but again, this is very typical for graffiti. So the lines just indicate the shape of the hull, the stems of the boat and the mast, and then in some cases we've got the sail. Variations in the depiction of sails. Two shapes could possibly be the merchant's marks, but that certainly needs more analysis. And there are many incised and pecked dots, lines, crisscrosses. So it does look as if there's actually been a lot of activity at Kilchattan Church, and particularly focused on these stones. But if we take a slightly wider look at graffiti on medieval churches, this was not uncommon. And although it seems to be much rarer in Scotland, in areas of England where the old parish churches have survived, there's a great deal of graffiti where people have come and made marks on the walls and have made it through very brightly coloured walls, and walls which will have had paintings on them as well. So the way we see churches now is so very different from the way pre-Reformation parishioners and users of churches and churches would have looked like. You can see here in the centre, Matthew Champion is the expert on medieval graffiti in English churches, and this is one of his depictions of what just a simple church. This is St. Nicholas Church at Blakeney, which has quite a lot of boat graffiti. This is what the church would have looked like inside. And of course, images were part of people's experience of going to church. So they were full of visual imagery and sensory experiences. And from the 12th century, images became the focus of devotion. They were treated like relics. So it was almost a substitute for a real relic. Was a carving or an image painted onto the church. People believed in the power of symbols and ritual acts to protect them from physical and spiritual dangers. And of course, the church wasn't just a consecrated space inside, it was also consecrated outside. And this too, so externally, within the precinct of the church, this was a place for acts of devotion, penance, and healing. And it's quite clear that the graffiti and the other marks and incisions on Kilchattan Church were made with intent. There was, and what I'm fairly certain of is that this is a longer term engagement with the images on the church and with the place itself. So this is rather more than just a passing fleet where they hopped off and spent the night and carved a few little things on the side of the church. Although that's not to say that some of the graffiti and some of the marks weren't made by passing mercenaries in the pay of the Scots and Norwegian Kings. So, and boat graffiti itself are also not uncommon in the medieval period. Again, like ours, Kilchattan, they're very stylized images, and you can see here just some of the images which appear on coins, on seals. And many of these are from the 13th century. They cover quite a long period from particularly from the 10th century through to the 13th century. So they're appearing on coins, seals, including, of course, Kings of the Isles, Lords of the Isles, frescoes, memorial stones, as in the Isle of Man, in medieval manuscripts and on ecclesiastical buildings. But particularly in Scandinavia and Scandinavian influenced areas, which of course applies to our area here. And the graffiti, even graffiti on inland churches, tend to be seagoing vessels. And they're often in English churches, for example, they're often clustered in spiritually important areas. So, for example, a chapel in a church that's dedicated to St. Nicholas, or a chapel, a chantry chapel set up by a guild of merchants, for example. So there does seem to be a particular association between boat graffiti and maritime activities. So one thing is, of course, is how were the graffiti made? Were they made through render and lime wash? Were they made at the time when the church was built and before it was rendered and lime washed, or perhaps at times when before rendering was being renewed. So this we don't know, and it's difficult to know how we might know. So I would love to have some feedback on that. Tools, well, people, women and men at that time carried tools on them. They carried scissors, daggers, so they had metal tools with them. This is one of the most difficult things. If the church was built in the late 12th century, it's any time after that, although one suspects from comparable dates of similar graffiti that it could be 13th century, perhaps into the 14th century. They are difficult to date. As you can see, they're rather stylized and generic images. There are two possibly significant features. That's the animal head prow and the weather vane. So the animal head prows, we can see typically on other 13th century images. So the wooden stick you see down on that right-hand corner, that's from Bergen. That's dated to the second half of the 13th century. It was dug up during excavations of the harbour, of the medieval harbour there. And so animal head or dragon prows were associated with boats of leaders and particularly of kings. But they also appear on manuscripts. There's a beautiful manuscript, which is the top right-hand image here, which depicts by Matthew Paris, and it depicts Becket's final months and weeks, in fact. And again, the boats are carrying animal head prows. The weather vane. So all the prows are broadly spread regionally. The weather vane is typically Scandinavian, and it's very much associated with boats of kings and leaders. They were, in real life, they were gilt weather vanes, very elaborately decorated. Some of them still survive in 13th century stave churches in Scandinavia. And they also appear on the Bergen stick. So this image at the bottom here is one of the sides of this stick on which graffiti are carved. And as you can see, it shows a whole series of stems of boats with 3 weather vanes depicted here. And this is the closest similarity with this particular symbol on Kilchattan Church. We've also got religious symbols. And again, I think this reiterates the point that the graffiti are most probably devotional and connected, and they're connected with people's Christian beliefs and practices. There are these crosses on the 2 stones with the sails and longships. One which is quite elaborate, and I have difficulty in finding exact similarities to this one, the one that's depicted in the top photograph. But it's closest to some of the quite elaborate processional altar crosses or amulet crucifixes, which are quite common in the later medieval period. We may have a ladder on one of the stones. This is the bottom photograph here. A possible ladder there. Again, that's not uncommon on medieval graffiti. Jacob's ladder, which was the route to salvation, climbing away from evil. And of course, there are associations between Christianity and boats, very marked associations in the 12th and 13th century. And King Haakon IV, for example, had the Mary, the Christ, and the cross as names of some of his boats. And sails and gear were often kept in churches. So marking a cross was a devotional ritual, a vow, or prayer to God and saints in physical form. And I'm wondering whether there's a possible association with pilgrimage. whether Kilchattan was a place of pilgrimage, and whether the pecking that we see are people collecting holy dust, which could be used as for healing purposes, the belief in healing. So why boat graffiti on Kilchattan? Because it does seem, although, as I've said, medieval graffiti in churches is not so uncommon. Boat graffiti is not so uncommon, but it does seem to be very rare in Scotland, and at the moment, I'm still not finding either through research on Canmore or starting to visit quite a lot of old parish churches, anything similar, or even one example. So I would really like feedback on this, and any recommendations on places that would be worth visiting. Obviously, boats were central to Hebridean economy and politics, so in a way we shouldn't be surprised to find boat graffiti at this period. It was a period when churches were being built, monastic settlements were being built, and that too was very much part of power and the establishment of power at this period. And boats were certainly plying the seas, and this wasn't just kings at the head of expeditions, lords, merchants in particular, a lot of mercenaries fighting in Ireland, for example, and elsewhere, ecclesiastics, pilgrims, particularly in this area, and of course we shouldn't forget just ordinary crew and families. And local communities would, of course, have been very much dependent upon boats and voyages. And shipwrecks were a fact of life. There were increasing storms from the mid-13th century. The Bishop of Argyll was drowned just off Kerrera, much at the same time as the 1249 expedition. So there were real dangers, and there were good reasons to pray for safe voyages, or to repent, perhaps, if you were particularly if you were a mercenary, or give thanks for being saved. So I think one question that would be again would be interesting to discuss is just how exceptional this assemblage of graffiti is, and whether this is just a question of the lack of surveying in Scotland or survival of evidence. One thought I've had, and this is a nice link in with some of the finds from the ACFA survey, is whether Ling's strategic position made it an important place in terms of this maritime world. And I think in particular of the promontory forts that we have, particularly around the southern end of Ling. So you can see the bottom one, this is South Ardling promontory earthwork, which was a discovery of the ACFA survey, with two of us holding a tape, as always in the rather cold conditions there. And the top one is West Ardling promontory earthwork, which was already known and recorded. And you can see the way that overlooked the Sound of Ling, looks over to the Strait of the Grey Dogs, out to the Atlantic. And there are other smaller promontory earthworks, which I think are quite unique and quite important, most probably medieval, but of unknown date. And they overlook not just the sounds east and west of Ling, but particularly south, right down the Sound of Jura, and westwards over to Dunconnell Fortress, which was one of the important fortresses of the Lords of Lorne and the Isles, and of course later the Lordship of the Isles. And it commanded the whole of the Firth of Lorne, an extremely important and strategic fortress. So is this part of the wider picture of what's going on that would help us to make sense of the graffiti at Kilchattan? I had one other thought, again, which I'm just investigating, is whether the Catton dedication is significant. Because although Catton was a 6th century Irish Gaelic saint whose main base was on Bute, he was the uncle of St. Blaine. So of course, Kin Blaine, and we know how important Kingarth on Bute was. But as you can see from this little distribution of red dots, the Kilchattan dedications have quite an interesting spread in this area, and they also coincide with the distribution of obviously earlier but rich Viking burials. And so it's not impossible that the choice of Kilchattan in terms of a church dedication is something that's undertaken, for example, in the 10th or 11th century. And there's quite a lot of thinking now about this, that this was part of the kind of establishment of this Norse Gallic entity, this very large regional entity. And that's certainly something that I'm starting to investigate. So I intend to visit all the other Kilchattan sites. I think their locations are quite significant, and whether that's some route to understanding the importance of Kilchattan here. So just finally, the interpretation is extremely difficult because this is a period of history where we don't have a great deal of documentation. And it's a very tortuous tangle, as it's been put. Dating would obviously be very helpful. And one thought is whether it's possible to date the mortar as has been done elsewhere, particularly in the Western Isles and the west of Scotland. Obviously, the symbolism is extremely difficult for us now to interpret, and much more analysis is needed, and comparisons across a wide geographical and probably time period as well. One thing to look at is whether there is in fact a connection with the runes in St. Molase's cave on the Holy Isle in Arran, which we absolutely know for certain, Alison can probably confirm this, are connected with King Haakon's expedition in 1263. The Scandinavian link, if there is one, with for example, with the weather vane, is this perhaps part of a kind of a cultural heritage of the area, this inner Hebridean area at this period in time? So are people drawing on a kind of past cultural heritage? It's clear that the graffiti and marks were meaningful acts, social, religious, and symbolic, and I'm absolutely certain, not a one-off event. So the place itself may be key to understanding its significance. So as I've said earlier, its maritime location, whether the Kilchattan dedication is significant, and there's a connection with the other Kilchattan dedicated churches, and an association with particular people. And again, I think it's probably too early to chuck out any associations with particular historical events. But it would be nice to be able perhaps to make a link between the graffiti and certain types of people. So whether that's for example, merchants. So some of the exploration will be to try and make more to get a greater understanding of some of the particular symbols that are incised on the church. So I welcome feedback. You'll probably work out from my presentation that this is an early point in the investigation. And so the more feedback that I get at this point and more suggestions of where we might look would be very helpful. So thank you for listening tonight.